questions or comments or reactions or problems on up to and including today's assignment? Yeah.
Yes.
I should have said, what are the specifics?
Yes.
What are the specifics?
Well, one of the things that Chuck and I were just talking about in the car that was helpful, and I think I've asked this before.
Okay.
But for me, some kind of continual repetition or contextualizing of whoever we're dealing with on a given day is helpful to kind of remind us where we're coming from in terms of some moves of the past. Okay. And on page 216 in the Hegel chapter, you lay out some of the steps having to do with weight, step one. Right. And that was a helpful little narrative for me, and to try to understand that further. And to include Kierkegaard in that kind of context is helpful. So, anyways,
okay. All right. Let me hold that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other observations, questions, problems? Yes.
I have a question about contingency. The contingency of the universe, in the sense that when does that actually get introduced? That concept of the contingency. You say Descartes takes it over from Aquinas, and it actually has to do with the incarnation, I assume. But
right.
Is that correct?
Well, certainly connected with that. I mean, most fundamentally with creation,
right.
And then, but incarnation and creation
are not the same.
They're not the same, but they're really impossible to separate in terms of the implications having to do with the what in modern terms might be called the absolute freedom of God to both create ex nihilo and to actually become a creature. Those are not the same thing, but they are not really unrelated in a fundamental way. So the radical contingency of the universe comes into being with the notion of creation ex nihilo.
Which comes into existence with Aquinas or before?
Well, it comes in before Aquinas. In other words, it's part and parcel of Christian dogma, effectively. Although the specifically intellectual understanding or translation of what we believe when we believe that God created the world from nothing, that takes a while. So I would say that the crispest formulation of it is Aquinas's. I was saying last time, I think, when we look at Augustine's text concerning the conversion from nothing to something, he has a sense of creation ex nihilo, but he sometimes, as I say, more often than not, calls it de nihilo, which suggests in the Latin a kind of, it suggests, you have to be careful, it suggests a kind of origination from nothing, as if, and I think this is his Platonism or his Neoplatonism, the residuum of his Neoplatonism affecting his way of speaking about what he believes to be the case. It's as if, in Augustine, I don't say literally now, but it's as if somehow or the nothing is a kind of matter from which things were converted into being. Okay? Now, I don't want to overstate that, but it's that indefiniteness in his imprecision, if you want, in his way of dealing with it. It's not that he doesn't believe the same doctrine that Aquinas does, but by the time you get to Aquinas, who has 800 years to think about this, plus he's an Aristotelian, I think helps Aquinas sharpen the notion of ex nihilo to mean a first now, which he then immediately says, as I've pointed out, you cannot demonstrate, therefore this is for Aquinas, it is simply an article of faith, simply and explicitly an article of faith. It cannot be comprehended scientifically. In fact, it doesn't make it, in a way, it contradicts any scientific knowledge, but better way of putting it for Aquinas is not so much, because that suggests Kierkegaard, it's not so much that it contradicts science, it's something that science can't grasp. It goes beyond what we can actually know, naturally speaking. And that issue is going to come up again indirectly in today's reading, too, the difference between Augustine and Thomas. Any other?
Quick
Yes.
comment. I don't know if anyone else was interested in this, but I did look up this business about the unknown gods.
Okay.
There's almost nothing in it. There are a few literary references to it, including the one that I mentioned, Pausanias, and it's just one line, and he's giving a picture of a certain area of Athens, and he says, and here were the altars to the unknown gods.
Plural.
All of the literary reference to it is plural, and there's no archaeological evidence of it.
Okay.
Just like the unknown soldier?
That was what I said last week.
Yeah. But see, that is interesting too. That he pluralizes it, which tells you that he or they, certainly the Athenians, didn't have in mind
It's not Yahweh, clearly.
Right, the one God who will have no other gods beside him.
Don't look it up on the net. There are 437,000 references to something called unknown gods.
There you go. Well, this shows that people are interested.
There's a lot of them.
Okay.
They're frustrated.
Any other things by way of openers? Okay, so we need to do a little catching up, and so to catch up we have to back up a little bit, and we never did quite get to Leibniz last time, so if we go back to page 196, he about maybe a third of the way down 196. Now in Leibniz, this essentially determined universe of intelligible entities is as such a specific arrangement of what is possible. In this way, Leibniz is to Descartes' generic thought of existence as Thomas Aquinas' specificity is to Augustine's generic knowledge of the transcendental essence of existence. The determination of the specific arrangement of what is possible is that of the principle of sufficient reason, or of God himself. Leibniz writes on the ultimate origination of the universe, quote, "The actually existing world is necessary only physically or hypothetically, but not absolutely or metaphysically. Suppose the world to be indeed in a determinate state now, then other determinate states will necessarily be engendered by it. Since therefore the ultimate root of the world must be in something which exists of metaphysical necessity, and since furthermore the reason of any existence can be only another existent, it follows that a unique entity must exist of metaphysical necessity, that is, that there is a being whose essence implies existence, God. Hence, there exists a being whose existence is different from the plurality of beings, that is, from the world. But let us explain somewhat more distinctly how from the eternal or essential, that is, metaphysical truths, the temporal or contingent, that is, physical truths, are derived. First, we must recognize this. From the fact that something rather than nothing exists, it follows that in possible things, or in their possibility or essence itself, there is a certain demand, or so to speak, a claim for existence. In short, that essence tends by itself toward existence. So if we pause there, I mean, there are a number of issues raised here. One of them is that God is distinguished from other beings in Leibniz by virtue of the fact that his essence necessitates his existence. All right? Whereas creatures, what we might call creatures in a theological context, or physical entities, are distinguished from the metaphysical being of God by virtue of the fact that their essence does not necessitate their existence. Right? Hegel will pick up on that in a very important way. We've already. This book does Hegel a couple of times and Kierkegaard a couple of times, so we've already done Hegel on this point, but just to tie it in here. For Hegel, I was emphasizing last time the profound originality of Hegel when it comes to the proof of the existence of God. All right? And for Hegel, he turns the tables on the whole tradition, including Kant, because even though Kant says we can't prove it one way or the other, nevertheless, in demonstrating that it cannot be demonstrated whether or not God exists, Kant, starts from the being of the world of our experience, just like Thomas and Aristotle do. Thomas and Aristotle conclude from the being of the world that there must be a first cause. But Hegel says, no. And so that's a mistake. Kant is not radical enough, you see. And the radical innovation that Hegel wants to insist upon is that it's the non-being of the world of our experience, the nothingness of the finite, is the being of the infinite, or the the being of God. It's not even a demonstration, so to speak, that you have to go through. I mean, it is the metaphysical demonstration of the being of the infinite, that the finite is a nothingness in and of itself, that it has no truth of its own. So in terms of what Leibniz, the distinction that Leibniz is making here, and I remember Leibniz, even though we're doing Leibniz after Hegel, Leibniz comes before Hegel, and Hegel is drawing on the tradition, and he's drawing on Leibniz and Spinoza, for that matter, and Kant. And so Hegel's version of this notion, the Leibnizian notion of God being the being whose essence necessitates its existence, you see it. It's complicated, but it's worth noting the complication. We don't actually have to solve all the problems. Part of the answer is knowing that there are problems and exactly where they are is very helpful, right? So you go back to Descartes. Descartes has two proofs for the existence of God in the Meditations. The one in Meditation 3, which is the proof that Descartes gives by virtue of the fact that he has this innate idea of positive infinite being. And he says, I am a finite being. That I can tell because I can't account for my own existence from moment to moment. And I could give myself, he doesn't say that he is doing it, but it's in principle conceivable to Descartes in the Meditations that as a finite creature, he could be the cause of the existence of the ideas of all of the finite things that he finds in his mind, like the body, the world, and so forth and so on. He might have just created those ideas himself because he's a finite thinker and there's nothing intrinsically beyond his capacity in ideas of finite things. But he could not come up with a positive idea of an infinite being if he's a finite being. Therefore, the infinite being must have given him this idea. That's the first proof in the Meditations. Now, but this is apparently the popular philosophic wisdom doesn't appreciate this point. But Descartes is very clear that this is what he calls the foremost argument for the existence of God. And in Meditation 5, he gives a second proof for the existence of God, which is the proof that's sometimes called the ontological proof. All right? And basically, to boil it down, what he says in Meditation 5 is that God, the idea of God as a perfect being, requires that being exists. In other words, if a perfect being didn't exist, it would lack something. It would not be perfect. It would be contradiction in terms, you might say, right? So the ontological proof, as it's called, is that in the very notion of God is contained the existence of God. All right. Now a couple of points to make here simultaneously, right? The major point to appreciate Descartes is that that's the second argument of Descartes. And it's not an independent argument. It depends upon the argument in the third meditation. You see? That is to say, if he doesn't know by virtue of an argument from causality that only a real infinite being could cause me, a finite creature, to have an idea of itself, I could not come up with that idea myself. Therefore, I conclude from the fact that I have the idea that this being caused me to have, therefore this being must be, right? Must exist. It's only because that idea is innately given to the creature that Descartes is by the Creator that he can then rely upon the idea to conclude in Meditation 5 that existence is included, right? That God must, right? The point being that if God didn't give him that idea, if it was his idea, Thomas would appreciate this. If Descartes thought it was his idea what God was, then he could not, no matter, even if his idea formally involved the existence of God, if it was his idea, he couldn't prove that God actually exists. You see, it's really very simple. Okay. But Hegel missed it in a certain way, right? Now, of course, a lot happens between Hegel and Descartes. Now, what started me off on this is in Hegel, following Leibniz, Hegel is very big on the ontological proof. Hegel overlooks, in effect, the foremost argument of Meditation 3, right? And Hegel latches onto the ontological proof as the most profound proof of God's existence, you see. That is, Hegel really has absolutized the notion of the innate idea in Descartes' consciousness, right? In other words, by the time you get to Hegel, you could say God has become, before Hegel, implicitly the natural world and explicitly so in Hegel. Or he has become, by the time you get to Kant, he is implicitly human consciousness and explicitly so in Hegel. Well, at that point, then, the distinction that Descartes is relying upon of what you might call the metaphysical externality of the creator to the creature and the causal relationship of implanting an idea of itself in the creature, that's irrelevant to Hegel, right? We've eliminated that kind of distance, as it were, between the creature and the creator. So he can then quite consistently, given his assumptions, he can quite consistently begin with the ontological argument, right? And so the connection, so what Hegel understands by the difference between the world, or the creation, and the creator, is precisely this Leibnizian point becomes absolute for Hegel. In other words, the divine being is that being, the notion of which cannot be distinguished or separated from its existence. To say, and what defines effectively a creature in Hegel is any being whose notion and whose existence are not coincident, which are not identical, right? Where one might fall away from the other, where they can be separated, where you can have one without the other. Right? Okay. Now, however, having said what I just said, I catch myself saying these things, right? So I wasn't planning to say this, but I'm going to say it. So now I can say, but now Leibniz, I said by the time you get to Hegel, the world is implicitly divine. Human consciousness is implicitly the divine consciousness. Hegel makes it explicit. Like, he says, this is what we've been doing all the time. He says, well, it starts here in Leibniz, because Leibniz, having made an analogous distinction between the divine essence and the creaturely essence, notice what does he say? That even the creaturely essences, while it's not necessary that they exist in the absolute sense that the divine essence requires the divine existence, analogously to that divine existence, they have within themselves, they have a demand or a claim or a right to exist. Right? So in other words, so what you have already in Leibniz is a kind of what you might call a kind of the relative divinity. Do you see what I'm saying? The relative divinity of the universe, and God is distinguished from these relatively divine essences in this sense of the word, by virtue of the fact that he has to arbitrate or make the judgment as to which of these essences, each of which in its own way has a natural right to exist. Right? You see what I'm saying? So in other words, it's not full-blown, automatic, simultaneous existence, but like God, there is that kind of tendency of the essence itself and its very nature to exist. Right? God then becomes the mediator among the competing claims of all of the essences, which of these can be actualized in what comes to be the best of all possible worlds.
This is
Leibniz, yeah. And the other thing you want to reflect on, I think it was the last time we read the passage from Augustine, where Augustine, in that place where I'm saying he talks about conversion as creation as a kind of conversion from nothing into being, right? In this context, remember, Augustine keeps repeating, and Adam asked the question, what does he mean? What claim did any creature have on God to exist? In other words, Augustine is saying rhetorically, because he was a great rhetorician, nothing had any claim to exist. In Leibnizian terms, nothing had any right to exist. Right? Nothing merited or earned or deserved, to exist. So when you go from Augustine to Leibniz, it's not a simple turnaround. It's a turnaround on another level. But Leibniz is saying really the opposite of Augustine. You say, in other words, it's not that nothing that God brought into existence in and of itself had any right or claim to exist, but quite the contrary. Everything that God brought into existence had a claim, a right inherent in its essence to be. So the possible essence, what you have to get this feel for, it's not, again, it's all semantics. You think of possibility as some sort of irreality, so to speak, but it's not quite that in Leibniz, because in modernity, as we were, I think, was included in our last reading. I don't know how hard we hit it, but we can hit it now. the big difference between potentiality and possibility, all right? The Aristotelian notion of potentiality is not the same thing as the modern idea of possibility, because in Aristotle, potentiality in reality, not in our temporal experience necessarily, but in reality, potentiality follows actuality. There must first be an eternal actuality for there to be any meaning to Aristotle of potentiality, which is always the realization, right, in time of some eternal actuality, right? So the essence includes, as I put it some meetings back talking about Thomas, the essence in Aristotle includes existence, all right? So nothing that happens in existence is going to break through that essence, right? There's a limit, and that limit, go back to the question about the limitness of the now, I think it was, right? That limit is perfection in the Greek mind, do you see? But in Thomas, we said the situation is essentially reversed. I have to put the ENCE here because the abbreviation might be confusing. Here we have not quite. I'll put it anyway. It's not because I'm using the word at this point indifferently. That here essentia is contained by, that is, it is subsequent to, it follows upon a prior being, right? So essence now in Thomas has been potentiated, right? Here we have actuality and potentiality in Aristotle. Here we have the level of actuality transcending what in the classical mind would be an eternal, unchanging level of essentiality. Do you see? So now the essences of Leibniz come in here after Thomas. They come in with a potentiality, as it were, or better. And I'm contradicting my linguistic distinction. They come in with, they come in with a. I was going to say. I'm going to meditate on that in a moment. A potentiality to exist, a possibility of existing. It's not. They might have a potentiality in terms of themselves, but it remains only a possibility because it requires God as some external agent, right, to actualize that potentiality. So in that sense, the potentiality is really reduced to a possibility, which is Leibniz's way of speaking, right? Possible essences. Yeah.
Okay. One, I think something that's helped me understand this is the shift in the word participation.
Okay.
That in, say, Neoplatonic or any Platonic thought, the participation of something in something else would have to do with the way in which an instantiation participates in a form.
Okay.
An object participates in the form that is its form.
Okay.
But after Thomas, the participation is not the form, but an existence. That creature's existence itself participates in the infinite essay
right.
of the God. So you've shifted the site of participation from essence to existence.
Okay. All right. And therefore, well, this is one of the things that are needed to be sought out in this book, which I try and sort out, but I mean, it's been a couple more years on it. But there's a shift when you get to Thomas. This analysis presupposes that, in effect, if not always clearly so in Aristotle, because this text is not exactly clear either, okay? But in effect, in Aristotle, when push comes to shove, the premise of this analysis is that essence transcends nature.
In Aristotle.
In Aristotle,
yeah.
Right. And therefore, analogously, essence transcends a level of logical form, rational form in Aristotle. But when esse transcends essence, it not only potentiates it, but it tends to reduce in Thomas, it tends to reduce essence or to confuse essence in some way with form and with nature in a way is no longer strictly Aristotelian. So I think...
But doesn't it have, isn't it somewhere in between here is the whole tradition from Dionysius the Areopagite and from the Arabs, in which you have a whole world of divine names which
right.
in fact constitute possibilities in the almost in a Leibnizian sense, even though in that case they're always they're subsequent to God in their existence. They're not something that God is beholden to, as it were, and it creates. They have no claim on God, in Asius, or in Avicenna, or in Araby, or all the different places where you have this configuration of a multiplicity of possibilities that are co-eternal with God. God is clearly a higher being than those angelic structures.
Right.
In Leibniz, that relationship has been shifted.
Right. And that's the point I want.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
Right. And the fact that in Leibniz, what otherwise are creatures have a claim to exist. What I was saying a moment ago is that is Leibniz's way, in effect, whether he intended it or not is another question. In effect, he's reintroducing a notion of divinity into the creature. It's a qualified divinity, would you say? I'm almost tempted to say he's already kind of introducing a kind of reintroducing a kind of polytheism here, you see, in effect, in some way. It's interesting to me, for example...
Well, it's almost like the Aristotelian situation, in which there's one big God that mediates the existence of everything, that is a being in itself. Because in Leibniz, God has to be a being. He's not beyond being. And there are all these other possibilities which would be like the Aristotelian personal essences.
Yes, but one of the differences would be the infinity of the God of Leibniz, right? The infinity of the universe is an un-Greek idea. All right. So, but vis-a-vis Augustine, the main thing is the shift now that things not yet existing are essences with a claim for existence. Back on 197, in short, that essence tends by itself toward existence. From this, it follows furthermore that everything possible, that is, all that expresses a possible essence or reality, tends with equal right toward existence, the degree of this tendency being proportionate to the quantity of essence or reality, that is, to the degree of perfection of the possible involved. From this, it must be concluded that out of the infinite number of combinations and series of possibles, one exists through which a maximum of essence of possibles is produced into existence. All right. On 198, starting, let me start at the bottom of 197. In the middle of that long sentence, about 5 lines up from the bottom of 197. Indeed, God is, as the sufficient reason of the existence of the universe itself, the supreme reason, who is essentially distinguished from other essences by reason of the fact that his possibility, his essence, is immediately his existence, while the existence of possible essences outside of God is mediated by a requirement in consideration of the claim of all possibles to exist, to produce existence to the greatest extent possible, absolutely. It is not by virtue of their participated existence that creatures are in the image of God, as in Thomas Aquinas, but rather in Leibniz's continuation of the translation of the fact of the history of being into terms of reason's own comprehension, that is, of the fact into the ideal of the history of being. Creatures are in the image of God in Leibniz by virtue of their essential likeness, which is my way of saying in the text what I've just said spontaneously, right? That the essential likeness, understand here, effectively a reintroduction of the divinity of the creature. So in that sense, reminiscent in a much changed world of something that we find in Aristotle. Hence, their claim to exist is recognized by God in bringing them to existence within the limits of the ideal or within the limits of the best possible world. In furtherance, therefore, of the contradiction that the doubt of Descartes is, in truth, to that of Augustine, Leibniz contradicts that coalescence of being with mercy, which in Augustine is God's creating of the world by converting it de nihilo into existence from a nothingness in which, as Augustine says, since it existed in no way whatsoever, it could possess no claim upon God to exist. All right. So the another way of understanding the implications of the notion of a possible essence at Leibniz is that although it can't be said that it existed fully, the essences in addition to God do exist in some way, as it were eternally, which would be another way of getting a handle on what we're referring to by the reintroduction of the notion of divinity into the creation. All right. Thomas Aquinas expressed this as the Novitas Mundi, or simple novelty of this universe before the first now of which it existed, not at all. Leibniz understands creation to be a matter not of mercy, but of justice. And he's very explicit about this, right? Every essence has a right to exist. It deserves to exist. It would be, you could say, unjust of God not to make some provision for it to exist. So whereas the creature raised from nothing into existence in Augustine is really the recipient of the merciful act of creation that God, and going back several meetings, I said one of the great subtle ironies in Thomas is that God is not only omnipotent because God is powerful and makes, where there's no potential, he makes a world. That's the kind of strong-arm version of omnipotence, which is not false, right? But it's not the chief meaning of omnipotence for Thomas. The chief meaning is divine mercy. When God does something that is not in response to any demand, where mercy as distinguished from justice, right? Where there's no right of anything to exist, which is emphasized by Augustine, God brings into existence things that have no right to exist. That is fundamentally an act of mercy, apart from its metaphysical omnipotence. It's a kind of spiritual omnipotence, as it were, a kind of absolute benevolence on the part of God, where he's not responding to any right or natural demand, or pre-existent demand might be a better way of putting it metaphysically. All right. And so he says, Leibniz, we're not reading this into Leibniz, just to quote him again from that same text on the ultimate origination of the universe, fourth line from the bottom of 198, there is no better verification of this than the very law of justice, which ordains that each one should have his share in the perfection of the universe, and that his happiness should be proportionate to his virtue and to his voluntary contribution to the common good. And then he says, this is what we call charity and love of God. All right? So justice is charity. Right? We in effect, he's saying, we reserve the name of love to justice. We will only call love justice, whereas the love in Augustine's mind and Thomas's mind transcends justice. Right? So there's a kind of collapsing of that distinction in Leibniz. All right. I think the monads are going to come back up again in today's assignment, so let's move into that. In fact, the 204 and 205, I won't review it, but it's, again, the distinction between the potential and the possible in today's reading. On page 205, about 6-7 lines from the bottom, Leibniz not only translates potentiality into possibility, but reverses the paradoxical order of both Aristotle and Aquinas so that actuality follows possibility precisely in the order of reality. All right. Now, again, since we're kind of, the text dovetails the history here, we've already done Kant in one way. We do him again in today's reading, in effect. Remember, in those four main categories of Kant, quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Modality, its three subdivisions are in this order, and this is the key point here. And so, in this respect, Kant is following Leibniz. Okay, modality's subcategories are possibility first, actuality second, or existence, it's sometimes read, and third, necessity. So if you look ahead to Hegel, take that as a little syllogism, the major premise, the starting point for Kant following Leibniz, right, is that everything begins with possibility. And actuality or existence comes second in the order, and then necessity marries the two ideas together. It's the synthetic idea in Kant. And so, again, what's going on in Kant is anticipated by Leibniz, and the major move here is to, by putting possibility before actuality, it's the way in which I could say Leibniz simultaneously rationalizes. That's a good way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it was that Leibniz turns mercy into justice. You could say the same thing, in effect, by saying that what Leibniz does is he rationalizes creation. You see, he rationalizes the freedom of God. And anticipating Hegel, he introduces into the freedom of God in creating the world, he introduces a notion of necessity. To say, so when possibility precedes actuality, it's the form, it's the concrete form in which Leibniz rationalizes the creation, and in effect extends the creation back in some kind of quasi-eternal way. You see, in a kind of ambivalently eternal way, back before that Novitas Mundi in Thomas. You see, there's something there. It's all these possible essences before the actual creation. To say, and so it's a kind of sneaky way of redivinizing the world, but it's fun. Okay.
Can I say
Yeah.
one thing?
I'll be right back.
Sure.
There seems to be, it might help to think about this a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
two different ways of evaluating the question of necessity.
Okay.
And different traditions have different attitudes about it. If you look at many Muslim traditions, for instance, the concept of necessity is the highest dignity of God is that he's the necessary being.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, he's the being who could not be.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other being about which it could be said, it had to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the source of necessity. Possibility has already in it is infected with a kind of negativity. The very first hypostasis, the very first angel, say, in Avicenna's cosmology, is only different from God in the sense that, from its own point of view, it might not have been. As a possibility means it could be or it couldn't be. So you've already introduced a binary choice in there. On the other hand, necessity looks like constraint. The negative evaluation of constraint is a sense in which God is limited by necessity, by any attempt to impose necessity upon God, because in that case there would be some constraint, some lack of freedom in God's own action. And that wouldn't apply particularly to God as a necessary being, but to the modality of necessity in relationship to everything that follows. So putting necessity low on the chart is a way of saying there is. Actually, I'm not quite getting how it fits in the Kantian one, but that sense that necessity is constraint, whereas possibility is freedom.
Okay, but in the case from a Hegelian point of view, and perhaps also from Leibniz's point of view, I mean, I think it's interesting. You said what did you say? Islam.
Avicenna is the one I know.
Yeah. See, that's it's interesting to me. God as a necessary being is also a modern idea working here in Leibniz and in Hegel, right? And I think it probably also, although God is not that important metaphysically to Kant, I think that would be Kant's way of understanding it too. The point being that if you go back to somebody like Thomas, God would not be defined as a necessary being. And if there was any negative necessity that God was subject to, the only one I can think of that Thomas would take seriously is that God cannot contradict himself. That's all. Right? But
so it's a logical necessity.
A purely logical necessity. That's correct. That's right. He cannot do anything contrary to his own nature.
Whereas in the ontological proof, there is that sense of logical necessity, in the sense that the ontological proof says, if God is the perfect being, and it would be an imperfection not to exist,
right?
By definition, the perfect being must exist, because it would otherwise be a contradiction to its nature. So that's assuming the kind of logical necessity as part of the proof itself.
Okay.
That there is
But see, what you just said was interesting. You said if God is such a being.
Well,
right?
but that's the form of it in say Anselm or in modern versions of Anselm. Put it as a question and then answer the question.
Yeah, but Barth, which I quote in Faith and Philosophy, Barth deals with this topic because it's a very sensitive topic. Hegel takes the ontological proof as, in a kind of uncritical way, is what Anselm was doing as Hegel understands it. And Barth points out that, no. Anselm says that God, I don't know whether he actually used the word if, but just to tie it together. If God is that being greater than whom none can be conceived, right, then it follows for Anselm that this being must exist.
Yeah.
All right. The non-Anselmian equivalent, or the Anselmian equivalent to the if, is that, as Barth points out, this name of God, he who greater than whom cannot be conceived, is understood by Anselm to be something he knows to be the name of God by faith. You see, so in Anselm, the so-called ontological proof rests upon a name which he understands to have been a revealed name of God, even though it's kind of intellectual revelation, right? But in other words, it's the intellectual equivalent of of revelation for Anselm. Starting with that revealed name of God, then God must exist. And the analog to this that I'm trying to stress in Descartes, as opposed to what happens after Descartes, in Descartes, the ontological proof of the fifth meditation presupposes the proof in the third meditation, which is the analog of Anselm's faith. Of Anselm's faith. Exactly. That's well put. So, yeah.
I'm just not sure how to bring this in. But I always thought the whole point of Anselm's proof was that it's out of the concept of God. Right. That the actuality, that the existence comes. Right. In which case it doesn't make sense to say if God is omnipotent, etc., etc. It's rather so in a way what you just said about the name, it's as if it's the concept has come.
No, I'm thinking about the way it appears in the mid-20th century issue with Jay and Findley and then Hartshorne, in which the logical structure of it is examined, and the question comes that if the proof goes either way depending on whether there is that actual act of faith. And one of them, I think Findley initially tries to critique the proof and show that you could follow out the logic of it and prove that God didn't exist, and then Hartshorne responds by following out exactly the same logic and showing that it does come about, and it does come to this matter of there being an initial act of faith that determines which way the logic goes. That it isn't actually that the logic fails in one instance and doesn't fail in another.
Still,
well, let's get. We got a number of issues going here. Yeah. That what Chuck just said reminds me of Peirce. Peirce makes the rather unsettling observation that it is false to believe that a syllogism has only one conclusion. Okay, so already the vagueness that's at the root of reality in American consciousness has seeped into the very notion of even the straightforward syllogism, right? In other words, our involvement, it's kind of pre-Kantian, pre-quantum mechanical. You see, in other words, so you could say faith in this particular case, but in other words, our reasoning is not independent of how we reason, right? That we affect somehow or maybe not absolutely in American thought, but in some way we affect the outcome of the syllogism. But if I heard where you started with that question, I think the point would be, let me put the point in the negative. In other words, the iffiness of the name comes when you reflect that Aristotle, who was no dunce, would not have had such an understanding of the divine, to see from which he would have, forget all the other differences, but in other words, that there's only one God, greater than whom none can be conceived, is not, it would appear from the history of mankind, it's not something that's immediately clear to the vast majority of human beings, right? Although, by the way, historically it seems to be an idea that's making headway. Now, I don't know whether that in any way addresses your concern.
Yeah, I think so. I think I was just really addressing what Chuck was saying.
Okay.
And I mean, I know other 20th century versions from the ones he mentioned, but it just struck me that what you just said about Anselm,
Right.
and what you said about Descartes,
Right.
namely that the concept, it's as if, I mean, in the case of Anselm, the existence of the concept for me has something to do with faith.
That's right.
For Descartes, it's as if, where did this come from? It must have come from something greater than that.
Than me,
Yeah.
right. Okay, well, if I say that Leibniz is in the business of a kind of wholesale rationalization of the notion of creation, he didn't start from scratch, and he's a Cartesian in some sense, and Descartes' innate idea is already a form of the rationalization of Anselm's faith.
Yeah.
Something like that, I think. Okay. All right. On page 208, speaking of the monad, well, actually back up again to 207 at the very bottom. There are doubtless 1,000 irregularities, 1,000 disorders and particulars, but it is impossible that there should be any in the whole, or even in each monad, because each monad is a living mirror of the universe, according to its point of view. Unquote. The law governing this best possible arrangement of things is known in its infinity only to God, who outside this infinite series, therefore, alone perceives, not ideally, but in the reality of his creative operation, that identity of even the least of the infinite monads, that is, that unique essential possibility in virtue of which Leibniz is able to maintain, together with the infinite order outside of which no monad would be actual, an individuality of the monad, not determined by the order qua order, which is not numerical or ideal, but a real, though indiscernible, unity of the thing. Dropping down a few lines, 5 lines or so, I see that the monad, as a living mirror of the universe, in actuality is, of its essence, illuminated by the analogy it is in substance to the now of eternity in the sacred doctrine of Thomas Aquinas, which is the unity of a thing possessing itself always in the same way. Now this gets, in today's reading, further on, there's a passage which, concerning Kant's understanding of time and motion, and it seems to me we're in very deep waters here. In the monad is the reflection of the whole universe. So each monad is different from other monads, given the fact that it is that whole universe from a certain perspective, and the perspective is different. Right? But the relationship in Leibniz, how shall I put it? The relationship between the monads is secondary to their identity, each monad's identity with the whole universe. And in that sense, even though it is perspectively the case, the monads are independent of one another in experience, right? In other words, the multiplicity of the monads and their relationship to one another is such that they, as he puts it somewhere in the text, one monad does not have access to the interior of another, right? So the monads remain, so to speak, outside of one another in some radical way. Now, this is going to be overcome effectively in Kant's redefinition of the world of our experience as one in which all things in our spatial temporal world are constituted by their relations with all other things, right? So the radical relationality of the Kantian universe is going to be something different than what Leibniz is doing. But what Leibniz is doing in the meantime is that he's got all of these monads, the inner identity of which is, strictly speaking, known only to God, right? Because they are, in some sense, each of them a kind of mirror of the divine as it is embodied in the creation, right? In the universe. And what I'm saying here in the middle of page 208 is that these monads existing, as it were, in this form, are existing in a kind of analogy to the nows of sacred doctrine that I discussed earlier in the text, right? That in the
Mystical body.
not so much the mystic. Well, not immediately. In other words, that in Thomas, when Thomas, how shall I put it? In one way, generalizes the notion of the Aristotelian now, such that there is a now of eternity and a now of time, and the now of eternity is a perfect now, and the now of time for Thomas is an imperfect now, when he detaches the notion of the now from temporality and imagines a eternal now, you see, which lacks the imperfection of a temporal now, and also lacks time in the sense that it is the whole we would say simultaneous possession, right, of reality. When Thomas does that, he in effect makes the nows, that is the natural nows, the nows of time, he makes them now to stand on the ground of the transcendental essence of existence, or to stand on the ground of the divine creative power, right? In the sense that they are no longer bound up with, inherently or intrinsically or exclusively bound up with the very nature of the temporality of our experience, right? So we see this recapitulated in Descartes' idea that the divine creative power is responsible for his existence in each successive instant, right? So the notion of time as a succession of nows is something that has it's operating in it's going to get complicated in a minute, okay? But just for openness, it's operating in Kant, or more complicated. It's going to be more complicated. Start with the notion that time is a kind of succession of nows, no one of which we can kind of hang on to, okay? If I throw my mind back a minute to Aristotle, in Aristotle, there's something true about that, but on the other hand, the now, insofar as it is the marker of time, the soul's marker, consciousness's, the psyche's way of counting off time in Aristotle, and that same soul has this eternal true self, as it were. The now corresponds in Aristotle to that eternal true self. So there isn't the sense that time is a series of nows slipping away out, right? You see, because in some sense we're always in Aristotle, even though in a way that we cannot quite remember, as he says, speaking about the essence. We are always in principle in Aristotle. We are always somehow or other in the now, because we have this eternal core of our being, right? But once the eternal core of the being is unplugged, or that plug is taken out, now we're in a world in which, not analogously, in which correspondingly, right, is an infinite succession of instants that are slipping away from us, because we have no, in a certain sense, we have no real connection with that, right, with that world. And Descartes certainly feels that way. Leibniz less so, because in possibilizing the essences, right, in beginning to re-divinize the world, all right, we are the way in which he does that is that we understand that each monad, each spiritual substance, right, each spiritually indivisible entity, which each monad is as a reflection of the whole universe, is, that's another way of saying, that's another dimension of the restoration of this eternality of this, right? So outside, so that's why and there's the disagreement between Kant and Leibniz. In Leibniz, the ideality of time and space, do you say, is its insubstantiality, but insubstantiality in the way in which Leibniz still, he kind of dismisses that time and space relative to the substantial reality of the monads, which are available to the intellect, right? So Leibniz knows substance in the monad in a way that is going to be denied by Kant, as we've already seen in a different context. Okay, so in Leibniz, I still have this eternal identity as a spiritual substance, or maybe I shouldn't say maybe I still have it, I'm recouping it now in the way of this identification with the whole of the universe, qua whole is the point I'm trying to make, okay? So the totality of the universe. And so one of the expressions he uses is that each monad is a total part. So if you look at the multiplicity of the monads, you would say, well, they're all parts of the whole, right? But since each part, in its own unique way, is the whole, a unique facet of the whole, but nevertheless of the whole, right? Then we have that multiplication of the oneness of the universe, a kind of infinite multiplication of that unity. Okay, so I want to take the eye off the multiplication part and focus on the wholeness that each part is in Leibniz, the wholeness that each monad is. And notice that wholeness in Leibniz now, in some sense, is substantially, or qua substance, it transcends the merely ideal forms of time and space, right? Relative to which wholeness, the divisibility of time and space is a secondary reality, right? In Kant, who will have, as I think I used the term in the text, who will have revoked the thought in matter in Leibniz, have revoked thought from matter, right? Or putting it another way, in Kant, for whom the noumenal world remains beyond our scientific ken, the limits of scientific knowledge being temporal spatial. In Kant, for whom that is the case, our understanding of our experience is grounded in what Kant calls the original synthetic unity of transcendental apperception, okay? Which is to say that there is a level of thought in which everything in our experience is unified, and from which, as it were, is generated or constituted the manifold of our experience, and the manifold as intelligible, therefore the manifold as unified, right? It derives from a original unity of consciousness, to put it in the simplest possible form, right? Which unity of consciousness is synthetic, right? Which is combinatory, which brings together the whole of our experience, right? Whether it's spatial and or temporal, right? That originary transcendental unity of apperception constitutes the whole of our temporal spatial experience, and it is a experience constituting unity. Right? Now, where it gets really interesting to me, especially coming up on Kierkegaard, is that Kant identifies this transcendental unity of apperception. He identifies it with time, in the sense of time itself, and says that time itself does not change, and that the only things, let's see if I can find the spot in the text here. It's 219. Thereabouts. At the bottom of page 220, in Kant, then, motion is the contradiction to the coexistence of objects in space at one and the same time. This contradiction to coexistence is possible only in successive times. Time is the measure of coexistence. It is the measure of the absence of motion, insofar as its now is, on the analogy to the now of eternity in sacred doctrine, employed by reason to mark, in its pure abstractness, a continuing presence of a number of objects. Motion itself, as the alteration of place, requires time as its formal condition merely, since actual motion is the synthesis of the manifold of space in the moment of apperception. Time and motion actually exclude one another. Matter in Kant is formally determined by a relativity of forces outside of itself as the condition for its comprehension by reason. So let's slow that film down. Time itself is distinguished as not moving, as stationary, is distinguished from things, from appearances in time which change, right? So the appearances that occur within the manifold that's synthesized by the transcendental unity of our perception, those things that transpire in the world of our experience, those things are always changing, and they are changing in time. But the time which is the medium for change is not the same time as the time that can be identified with the transcendental unity of our perception. It itself doesn't change. And the point I'm trying to make...
Which doesn't change?
I think the latter. The time itself,
okay,
as opposed to the time which is the medium in which things change. All right? I guess you could say, a way of putting it might be, try and clarify it, the time which constitutes the world of our experience as the constitution of it, that's unchanging, right? He distinguishes time in this what you might call this unchanging sense. He distinguishes it from what he calls the inner sense. So time and space, if you contrast time and space for Kant, time is the inner sense and space is the outer sense. And there's further in that comparison, the outer sense depends upon the inner sense. In other words, everything must be in time, right? That's true. However, Kant says, just to make it tough, we can't conceptualize time except spatially. Okay. So, in other words, he knows, Hegel would say speculatively, that time is something prior to space, ontologically, as it were, right? And perhaps logically, prior to space, and yet the limitations of our mode of conceptualizing, which require sensible intuition of time and space, are such that we can form no concept of time except spatially. So, for example, to apply that to what I'm just saying, if I think of time in the sense of the place in which change takes place, then Kant likes to keep pointing out that I think of time in terms of a line. Right? So the progress of time, a timeline, right? A time as some path over which something may move, or in terms of which one can measure a difference of times. Do you say? So that's a spatialized image. But if I think of time in the originary sense as unchanging, then the only way I can conceive of that is on the image of a space, of a kind of a pure space. And pure space, as I said with my metaphysical vacuum cleaner a couple of meetings back, pure space, that is when I vacuum out for thought project, vacuum out the time, anything in pure space, what's going to happen to it? It's going to be eternal, practically eternal. It's not going to be able to change because it takes time to change. Okay? So we get the irony. The irony is that this originary time, right, the profoundly originary time, we cannot conceive of except in terms of a spatial understanding of it as permanence. So the ultimate root of pure time for Kant, ironically, is permanence. To see, and unchangeableness, and then things change within time, but time itself does not change. So time itself is taken on in Kant a kind of the quality of, here's what I'm trying to get at in the text, it is taken on the quality of Thomas's eternal now. Okay? Except now it's not the eternal now of Thomas's in which God lives in heaven, you see, prior to, before, beyond, transcendent to the created world, but the created world in Kant, in effect, now we have to be very careful here, because I'm accusing him of this. I'm not saying this was his project exactly. You understand what I'm saying? I'm saying because his project was scientific on one hand, it was moral on another. Right? But in effect, what he is, he's grounded his understanding of our understanding of the world of science. He's grounded in a notion of pure temporality, which has taken on, in effect, the quality of Thomas's eternal now, the now in which God lived. Right? So you see, if you're following me, this is another. I'm trying to build toward where's Hegel coming from? Is he crazy? Is he just a lunatic? But no, because in effect, you see, Kant, in his own very discreet way, and as I say, perhaps not quite intentionally, right, has divinized human consciousness and the time which is at the root of, or the ground, or which is ultimately the world in which we have our experience, has taken on the quality of the divine now, the eternal Thomistic now. Make any sense? Yeah.
So the transcendental unity of apperception is the reason that can be found in the phenomenal world? Or does
you have to be careful there.
Is that the noumenal kind of that we don't have access to?
Okay. It's, in one sense, it's noumenal. Okay? It's noumenal in the sense that it cannot be an object of science. It's not a scientific object. It's not an object of knowledge. Kant says in the Critique, he makes the distinction between knowing. It's an old distinction, but he applies it to this question. In the knowledge that we do have, if you want to speak that way, of the original synthetic unity of apperception, we have, in some sense, a knowledge. Now, this is kind of Cartesian. We have a knowledge of ourselves, of the. Now, of course, it's very abstract, of the universal cogito, of the I think. You see, of the we have a knowledge of self-consciousness, but we don't have a knowledge, which we've already anticipated, of what it is that we are. What the knowledge that we have is a knowledge of the fact that we are. Right? In other words, so we have a knowledge of fact, a knowledge of our existence, and in that sense, he's still with Descartes. You see, but unlike Descartes, this is not a knowledge of substance. It's not where the noumenal is an object of knowing or of science. You see, so put it in classical terms that Aristotle wanted to say, we don't know what it is. Right? The only way we can conceive of it would be a careful way of putting it, is we can conceive of it in terms of time and space. And if we conceive of it in terms of time and space, then we can conceive of it as a pure originary temporality. I'm thinking now of Husserl and Heidegger. You know, where did they come from? Did they come out of the woodwork? Yeah? Where did they come from? See? So Kant, who's just doing his thing, and he's not resonating on all this, but he's got this idea that at the root of our consciousness, you see, is a kind of profound temporality. But we only can we do not grasp it as a noumenon. We grasp it in terms of appearances within the limits of time and of the forms of our transcendental imagination, which are time and space, and we grasp it as a pure time, but we can't grasp pure time except we can't imagine it except as spatial.
So that's why he's following Thomas' distinction between the two nows, almost, in the sense that you were saying that there's some suggestion of this eternal divinized now, even though the only access we have to time is through its appearances, which are not that. They're the now that occurs It's not the perfect now.
Yeah, all right. So the now I think I understand where you're at. Yeah, so the time that changes in Kant, right, is analogous to the time of the imperfect now, or in Thomas, right, and the eternal now in which God is in Thomas, right, which transcends the creation, right, has now been identified, thanks, let's say, to the work that Leibniz has been doing in the meantime, has now, in effect, been identified with the root of the consciousnness of worldly experience in Kant. Right? But he's not going to quite put it that way because it's not his project. I mean, in other words, he's not saying it's God, because God for him is just an idea of reason, not an unimportant idea of reason, profoundly important in the practical intellect, in morality, and important as a regulative ideal of unity in the scientific realm, in the realm of nature. But there he explicitly says God, as a specific idea, is the symbol of the transcendental self-consciousness. It's the way the transcendental self-consciousness symbolizes itself. Do you see what's happening? Right. So in a way, he's admitting what I'm saying, but he's not addressing it. He's not coming at it the way I'm saying. Right? In other words, he's not noticing explicitly that this unchanging time, which is at the root of our experience of the world, has taken on something of the quality of the eternal now in Thomas. He's not noticing that exactly. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. But he is backwards noticing it by saying that God is the symbol of this transcendental self-consciousness.
So
do you see that?
So the wall erected between that Kant has supposedly established between the phenomenal and the noumenal, let's say, actually is being infiltrated formally more than he maybe would cop to.
Yes, I think that's right, and I think that's where Hegel's coming from. See, Hegel is seeing this in his own way now, his own very original way, and he's saying, "My God, he's almost got it." Do you see? He's almost got it. Right? This is not just some symbolic idea of God. This is God working. Right? This is God manifesting God in time and space. Right? This is God manifesting God in creation. So that this transcendental time itself kind of root that I'm pointing at in Kant is the ground of the world of our, as we would, in Thomas we would call the created world. Do you see? Then Hegel wants to say, well, then God somehow or other has manifested himself in the very form of the creation. Right? And now there's a long pedigree to this. In other words, even Augustine is very sold on the idea that God, and Thomas also, that the creation is not just as man is in the image of God, but the creation is the image of God, especially for Augustine, in the image of the Trinity. See, and Hegel's going to pick up on that in his own, again, post-Cartesian and modern way. But I guess what I want to say, since we're doing this, in the meantime, what's dropping out here, in other words, when the creator and the creation are coalescing here, right, they're doing so at the expense, as it were, of the transcendent deity who remains explicit in Augustine and in Thomas, do you see? And whose transcendence is at least logically reflected in Descartes' first proof of the existence of God. Do you see? So Descartes is on the fence. There's a certain irreducible ambiguity in Descartes because he's got the innate idea. It's an integral. It's part of his consciousness, and it's what his consciousness is what Descartes really says. He both is the idea of God, and he has the idea of God. Right. So, but since there's that, he's making that distinction that he has and he is. Then he has also the external ontological cause in a God outside, of which, however, he would have no direct knowledge. He would know that God representationally. You see? So he has a knowledge of God. He has a representation of God, which is like the revealed name of God that Anselm has. But now it's a representation which he is and which has been given to him, right? And therefore his faith is not explicitly at issue for Descartes. He's left his faith on the doorstep, as I said in a different context. Do you see? Now, the critique of Descartes, there's so many critiques of poor Descartes. When you really got something, you can afford to be critiqued for 500 or 600 years, right? So one easy critique of Descartes is, where did he get such an idea, right? He obviously got... I mean, I've been asked by several of you, how do I justify this impossible text? And I justified it to myself for the last 3 or 4 days because I'm reading it and I'm trying to figure out what the hell is going on here, right? And so one justification of the text is that the whole point of all of this is to get some insight, right? To understand what's going on. Well, you can't understand by memorizing things. You know what I mean? You got to think it through. Okay? So I forced myself, having to read my own text, to think this through. And the more I thought about it, and this is why this is good because we have a new text here. See, this idea of the moment comes up again. Huh?
God help us.
Well, okay.
Want to know?
No, I don't mean it that way. I mean a commentary. The moment in Kierkegaard is a central idea, right? Kierkegaard uses the idea of the moment, right? Now the moment appears already. Kant keeps slipping these things in. Like Levinas talks about going back beyond the point of zero. Going back beyond the starting point of consciousness. This is Levinas. Well, after a while, you read enough Levinas, and he says he makes reference to Kant. And you go and you look at Kant, and son of a gun, Kant talked about going back below zero in order to critique reason. So Kant has got it there, and Levinas is just running with it, okay, in a very original way. Don't misunderstand me. Okay, so...
Just a second. You know where the Japanese fighter plane name came from?
No.
You know what it was called, don't you?
No.
The Zero.
And it came from?
It came from the year in which it was made, which had 2 zeros at the end of it. You ought to look into that.
Okay, all right. I'm sure that's relevant.
It's only comic relief.
Okay, but what I'm trying to focus on here is the moment in Kierkegaard, and the moment in Kierkegaard in today's reading is the moment when the eternal enters into time. It's the instant, and so forth and so on. Without anticipating that too much, go back to Kant. In Kant, this time itself that I was trying to focus on that idea, this kind of what, to borrow a Husserlian term in a slightly different context perhaps, but this temporality which is at the root of our conscious apprehension of the world, this fundamental temporality is what I'm trying to this temporality which has something of the eternal quality, of the divine quality, of a kind of, that it itself, it's the arena for change, but it itself doesn't change. Now remember, that anticipates Hegel, because we said Hegel, he's got this absolute dynamism going on of the self-concluding, eternally self-concluding and self-building syllogism, right? And yet what? And yet nothing is going to... It has no environment. It's not Jamesian. It's not American, right? Nothing is going to change all of this change. It reminds me of Heraclitus, right? Everything is in change, everything is in flux, but it had no beginning, it has no end. That is, change hasn't changed, right? Okay, so we have that moment is there in Kant, all right? He's not spending too much time on it as the moment, but he does refer to it as a moment in German. He calls it the moment. This what I'm calling this kind of originary temporality. And he refers to it as a causality, all right? And it's a causality of a continuous causality of change. So go back to what I was saying before. There's time in the sense the time in which things change. But what causes there to be a time in which things change? There's a kind of primordial temporality, do you see, which is the cause of all changes in time. Do you see? It itself does not change, the causality. Now you should think again. We say Aristotle's coming back in through the woodwork. He's coming in through the cracks in the, we put up the plastic with the duct tape and so on, and Aristotle's coming in to annihilate us in any event. Right? It's the poison gas is coming back into modern consciousness. You see, he's seeping back in here because this is the. It's great. So momentum, I'm saying to myself, what is moment? What does it mean? I mean, I think I have an idea of moment, right? So I look it up in the dictionary, and it comes from movimem, which is from movio, which is to move. Okay? And then if you read the dictionary, it says, it means to move, and then it means, Kant must have read the same dictionary, it means to cause. And then I said, well, of course, Aristotle told us this a long time ago. Right? In other words, the first cause was the first mover. And the only thing that distinguished this mover from any other mover was that it didn't move. Do you see what I'm saying? So, see, it's a joke. But we're living it. We're living it. Okay. So, the unmoved mover is now been, thanks to all that's gone on the last couple thousand years, has now been transformed into the kind of the root of our experience of the world. You see? And and just as in an Aristotelian universe, in every little soul there was a little unmoved mover. There was a motor. You see? Okay. It's nice. It's nice. Okay. So now, but this is important to understand this. Because these guys are doing all this other stuff, see? But there's something going on here. And Kierkegaard, Hegel has the virtue as a great thinker of being able to grab it, and just lay it all out there, right? This is everything, our whole experience is the manifestation of the divine creative act, the movement, which itself, as I've just said in another way, but the Hegelian absolute motion, which is the divine syllogism, life, it doesn't move because it has nowhere to go. It has no space outside of itself. It has no time outside of itself. Okay, but I was about to say, but Kierkegaard, in his own way, is not only Hegelian in the way which I was in some details I was trying to show last time in attacking Hegel, but he's got the same virtue of Hegel. That is, in attacking Hegel, he does a Hegel. I mean, in a deep way, he gets to the heart of the matter. Do you see? That the God of revelation, this is not that God. All right? In other words, this is an absolute either or. But in the meantime, the God who is not the God of revelation has stolen the show. I mean, in other words, he's got it locked. It's all locked up. It's the only game in town. And if I'm going to be Kierkegaard, I got to get out of here. Right? But that's impossible because I have nowhere to go, in any intelligible sense. Something like that. Okay. All right, so let's maybe move a little bit back into Hegel here then, since we're on page 221. So right after that section there, referring to the moment of apperception as Kant talks about it as the continuous causality of change, just to summarize what I just said. But for Hegel, the interstice, infinitely small though it may be, the interstice that he sees between any 2 points of contact or any two nows, so both in the multiplicity, all right, let's focus now, get off the stationary part a moment, right? Focusing on the realm of change, the realm in which one now can be compared to another now, when one place can be compared or come into contact with another place, right? So in that realm, which in an Aristotelian world is the world in which these two hands come together to touch, where the identity of the feeling and the felt is potential. In the actual identity of the feeling and the felt, there's no distinction between the hand and the top of the table. That's the whole idea. Otherwise, there would be no feeling going on, right? Okay. Analogously, in Aristotle, the knower and the known, at the point of contact, right, the difference between the knower and the known is obliterated. It doesn't exist in the act of knowledge. There is an identity. Remember, that's the original difficulty which we want to allow Aristotle to keep for himself. Okay. So now Hegel, being a good Aristotelian, he's focused now on this point of contact, right? Which he understands has got to be the place to look, so to speak. But in this point of contact, what Hegel sees, and we ought not to be surprised at this, right? In other words, he's going to see some sort of interstice, some sort of gap, some sort of opening. Do you see? That is, because if he didn't do that, he wouldn't have a divine mind that was moving within itself. It wouldn't have a divine mind that had three moments. So if Kant, in effect, has rooted the whole of our conscious experience of the world, if he's rooted it in some godlike moment, which he doesn't refer to that way, you see, but of which God is the symbol, well, then what Hegel has done is that he's made of that moment a dance of three moments. Do you see? He's said that one moment. This is why Hegel thinks he's a good Christian, right? That's really it. One God is Trinity, right? So the moment for Hegel has got to be three moments. The moment, this creative moment, this divine moment. Now, if I can run all this together, has got to be a syllogism. It's got to have three stages, three subsidiary moments of creativity, just like the categories in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Only now this is all living. So there's got to be an interstice in the point of contact for Hegel. It's an absolute requirement. If we're not going to go right back to Aristotle, there would be no point in doing that, apart from the fact it's impossible. Okay. So for Hegel, the interstice, infinitely small though it may be, posited by bodies in contact, like the now of time, is the opening, the breach in this externality of forces through which space is measured immediately. Let me just stop there. Why did I say that? Externality. Now, I mean, in the context, you could read it in a number of different ways, but I'm thinking here metaphysically, what's really interesting is, remember that the first thing that Hegel says about Aristotle in chapter 1, by quotation, is that Aristotle, if you want a philosopher, you've got to start with Aristotle, because Aristotle really knew how to speculate. That's Hegel's attitude, right? However, he never got it all together because he was hung up in the particularity of things, right? That's right. Well, see, the particularity of things is just a nice everyday way of talking about, on another level, the externality of Aristotle's metaphysics. You see, we are external. We don't remember the identity of the mind with its object in the act of knowledge. Metaphysically speaking, epistemologically speaking, we're on the outside of that, or it's on the outside of us, you see?
Because it's prior.
Yeah. Well, logically prior, but I mean, just experientially. In other words, it's in another room. It's the other side of the fence, you see? So when Hegel's complaining about the externality of things, now he complains about the externality of things on every level, by the way. So he does have a real complaint about what he calls the bad infinite. The bad infinite is, I can get another one of these. I can just keep adding, or arithmetically. I can always add one to the last number, right? So for Hegel, that's the bad infinite. That's a stupid idea of the infinite because it's external, right? It's just adding on. You see, outside of what I've got, I add on another one, right? And I think I'm going somewhere, and Hegel says, you're an idiot. You're not going anywhere, right? In principle, you're doing the same thing over and over again. You're not making any progress at all. You think you're making a lot of progress by adding on externally. Do you see? Is there a good infinity? Well, of course, the whole thing is the good infinity. Right? But the good infinity is not an external addition. Do you see? It's not the adding on, it's the consuming of everything. It's the unifying of everything in one thing. Do you see? That is the good infinity. So an infinite incorporation. Oh, talk about incarnation. See? An infinite incorporation by God of the whole of the universe, right? That's the good infinity, and that's the genuine infinity, and it's not external.
And the other extreme to that would be the kind of stagnance of an Aristotelian kind of
yes.
Without
Well,
the interstice.
Yeah, except that we have to be fair to Aristotle, and Hegel would understand. The externality in Aristotle is not simply stagnation, because although it's hard for us to fully appreciate it, probably because, as Kant is saying in his own world for his own reasons, the noumenal was not out of reach for Aristotle by no means, right? It was out of the reach of reason, but it was not out of our reach because we were not simply rational as we become after creation ex nihilo. So we were divine, at least in part. And that was enough to make the limitations of rational animality, when it came to knowing, not ultimately a bother to Aristotle. Do you see? Not an ultimate bother. Okay. So in that context, in that world in which we were of the same quality, at least in our essential root, we were of the same quality as the unmoved mover, Aristotle could understand, technically, he could understand that divine something or other was an activity. So I just want to say, when you say, I have to be very careful, because he wasn't taking as an ultimate measure of movement and stasis. And this is a complaint that I make about Kierkegaard in the footnote. He wasn't reducing change, the specific comment I make about Kierkegaard is that his modernity shows when he includes change under the category of kinesis, under the category of motion. And I point out that Aristotle explicitly excludes it from motion. In other words, he doesn't say that all change is a form of motion, but Kierkegaard assumes that. Okay? Now, of course, a form of motion, why would Kierkegaard be assuming that? Because you cannot escape exactly being in the 19th century, whether you're for or against Hegel or for or against Kant or whatever your qualms are. You are living in a world in which Kant has properly pointed to the fact, and Hegel in his own way has amplified it, that at the root of the reality of our being is motion, right? And therefore, it's perfectly sensible for Kierkegaard to, I don't know whether he deliberately did, I don't remember whether he deliberately did it in that passage, but in effect to correct Aristotle. But to go back to your question, so Aristotle doesn't understand change to be simply a subcategory of motion, number one. And the more important point I want to get to is that, therefore, analogously, activity doesn't require, it's not a subcategory of either motion or change. Do you see what I'm saying? So in other words, for Aristotle, the fact that there's no alteration in the divine does not mean that it isn't activity. In fact, the highest activity is such that it does not suffer alteration, because alteration, change, as well as motion in general, requires potentiality. So, yes, by modern standards, the Aristotelian universe is static. But that's only because, as moderns, we were just born into a consciousness which does not take seriously certainly, I would say in Hegel doesn't take it at all seriously, and in Kant doesn't take it as practically serious, that there is being beyond temporal spatial reality, or that there is activity beyond motion or change, something like that. Okay, so it's relative, I think. Okay, so back to Hegel here. So Hegel, the interstice, infinitely small though it may be, posited by bodies in contact, like the now of time, is the opening, the breach in this externality of forces. Right. So here I'm talking about the externality of forces, and I've just generalized it to the externality of a kind of metaphysical externality, which in the case of Leibniz would come down to the same thing, right? Perhaps. Through which space is measured immediately. This interstice is the real continuity of matter. Right. By the nature of motion, two bodies occupy the same space in the same time, so that Hegel understands that matter itself, by virtue of its own essence or weight, generates space. The actuality of space is time. The truth of time is motion. The truth of motion is the self-determination of the notion in matter, whose moments constitute the contradiction of being for self together with not being for self. So let's pause. Now I think that's a fairly straightforward recapitulation of Hegel and the impossibility that a lot of people find in Hegel. Okay, that two things are and are not in the same place at the same time is contradiction, the principle of contradiction. And Hegel is saying, I think he said elsewhere in our text already, I think I passed over the passage in class, that life is contradiction, or maybe I'm coming to it, right? And so for Hegel, there is no life where there's no contradiction. So the living God must be a self-contradicting deity. And how can I have self-contradiction when Thomas Aquinas told me that the one thing that God can't do is contradict himself? You see? But for Hegel, the one thing that God does do in order to create the world is precisely to contradict himself. Right? How can he contradict himself? Well, he can contradict himself because the contradiction of himself is overcome because of the motion. In other words, the contradiction it's not a final contradiction. Contradiction has been subordinated to the motion. Right? You could almost say the logic has been subordinated, or logic now has been included in the category of motion, if I can put it that way, or has been identified with the highest category of motion, or at the highest level. The motion and logic in Hegel are, in effect, identified. Hegel's way of putting that was, which we quoted earlier, that logic and metaphysics are identical. Well, for Hegel, metaphysics is things held in thought. Right? In Kantian terms, what Hegel has in mind there is things conceptualized. But things conceptualized are the things of our experience, right? In the moving world of our experience that Kant is talking about, right? The logos of Hegel, right, identifies, or Hegel identifies the logos. He identifies the divine reason. You see, the noumenal reason in a Kantian universe, he identifies that with things conceptualized, with the moving world of time and space. They are the same, they are identical, even though they are opposites. That's the dialectic. That's the self-contradiction that moves and in effect is the creation of the world. Now there was something else I wanted to say about that. Where I just left off, the actuality of space is time, the truth of time is motion, and the truth of motion is the self-determination of the notion. Right? So it's kind of a little poetic punning there, or rhyming, right? The notion and the motion. Okay. So the motion is, as it were, the expression of, the motion is the expression of the notion. Okay? And the motion's first expression is time. And the furthest extension of that sequence is space. So running it backwards, time is the truth of space, motion is the truth of time, and the notion, ultimately the divine idea, is the truth of motion. Okay. Now, what I want to say about that particular sequence, which is just straight Hegel, is that there is a way in which you can see perhaps how he has reached down into the coat that Kant's thought is, the reversible coat, and turn the blue side out, and the red side is now in. Do you see? Now motion is on top. Okay? Because of what I was describing to you a while back, trying to describe, that unchanging temporality in Kant, which is really fundamentally at the root of the world of our experience, right? We said was what? Was static, was unmoving. You see? And it was constitutive of the world of change in time and space, you see? It was constitutive of the world of motion. But Hegel has now taken that motion, which in a certain sense might be the last thing to be seen in Kant's view, looking at it reflectively, as Hegel would say, and broken through that reflection to the true root of the matter. The last thing, here's a good rule in Hegel. The first thing is the last. He got this from the New Testament. The first thing is the last, and the last is the first. Okay? I gave you the concrete example that a real individual is not a particular human. If I say that Alia is a particular human being there is the universal, and then her being in that chair with that physiology and so forth, that's the particularity of the human, and I put those together and I say, well, that's Alia, right? But Hegel is saying, no. You what you know is Alia, and then you analyze what you're dealing with there, that concrete being, and you say, well, this falls under the category of the universal and the particular. So you see, in other words, I abstract. I never encounter raw humanity. I haven't met it yet, and I never encounter raw particularity. That's one of Kierkegaard's problems. in today's text, you see, because for Kierkegaard, he wants to pose, it's impossible. It's great when you're in the absurd position to be able to make the best of it. You know, it's like he does a Descartes. Descartes says, "Oh, everything we think is dubious." Is that what Thomas said? Oh yeah, everything is dubious. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to doubt everything. I can doubt everything I think, and he wins through, right? Okay. Kierkegaard, the analogy to Descartes is that Kierkegaard realizes what I just said is true in the Hegelian world and in the world of our experience. I never encounter the universal, pure and simple. And the point I'm getting at in Kierkegaard, I never encounter pure and simple, the particular. I never encounter the particular. I always encounter a particular something or other, right? So to want to single out the particular as such is an absurdity. So Kierkegaard says, well, let's go with that. Do you see? Yeah, it's an absurdity. Now I'm going to understand that faith, right? That God. So when I went to grammar school, the message I got was the theology wasn't too heavy, right? It was kind of direct. So the message was that Jesus Christ came down from heaven, died on the cross. Why did he do that? Well, first and foremost, he did it for Leahy. Did it for me. But do you believe that? See? In other words, wow, really? Okay. I mean, that's quite a move. See? I mean, look, if he just did it for mankind, it would also already be kind of peculiar. See? I mean, even mankind. But how about for each individual? That's where Kierkegaard's at, right? And so both logically, ontologically, theologically, it's absurd. Do you see? I mean, there's no way in which it isn't absurd. But if you want to really zero in on how absurd it is, and you want to do so in a way that's authentic to our, actually, here we are, whether we like it or not, we're here. This is really weird. Don't you think this is weird? Did you notice that? You're still young enough to remember that experience, right? Or have you had that one yet? You're walking down the street, and boy, you almost go out of your mind. You think maybe you should see a doctor. This is really bizarre, our existence. We got so used to it, though. See? But Kierkegaard is saying, well, think about it. Think about it. This whole thing this is crazy. What is this? I mean, really, I'm so used to it. I think is this me? Huh? What a strange animal, really wild. Really wild. It's really wild. Okay. So if you think about this, we don't have to go with the outer space or what's it, Rod Serling, the Twilight Zone. See? Okay. Kierkegaard is already spiritually pointing to the fact that we're in a Twilight Zone. What is going on here, right? Now, the Christian answer to this weirdness, to this Twilight Zone, doesn't help any, right? In other words, it makes it more weird, as it were, right? In some sense, okay? On the other hand, it's it's like the arsenic that cures, as opposed to the arsenic you get in church and watch those coffee clatches, right? Okay? So what I'm saying is that the particular has no standing, go back to Hegel now, but neither the universal nor the particular has any real standing apart from the conclusion, apart from the end, right, of the syllogism, apart from the concrete individual. All right. So back to his text, or my summary of his text. The actuality of space is that the truth of motion is the self-determination notion in matter, whose moments constitute the contradiction of being for self together with the not being for self. So even maybe I make that a little more pedestrian, more Jamesian, more Kierkegaardian, but true to Hegel. See, in other words, what he's saying is this: that the joke, that's a nice sweater, not that little joke, that fact that, as James says, every affirmative sentence can have a not attached to it, there's nothing in our experience that doesn't admit of its negation, including our experience, which everything indicates is going to come to an end sooner or later. You see? Okay, so that negation that's in our experience, when I say that Hegel says that the divine is realizing itself in the material world, well, then you could argue, and if you buy the whole tradition that God, the image of God is in his creation, then the negativity, which is undeniable, I mean, I can deny it if I want, I can live in Neverland, I can not think, I can not face up to the reality of my existence, but if I do, and I take it seriously, and I try not to deny the concrete reality of my experience, which is riddled with negation, then that negation must be in God. If Augustine was right, if Thomas was right, that as Thomas likes to say in every context, and in this context especially, that the agent produces its likeness in what it produces, and the product always, and this is where Descartes was coming from, the agent always produces its likeness. Well, if God created this world, and this world is riddled with negativity, that must be a likeness of the negative in God. There must be that negative moment in God. There must be that, you see, it's intrinsic. It's not something outside of the exemplary likeness of God. It's not an atheistic Feuerbachian reversal of the analogy. It's not saying that God is a projection of my. In fact, quite the contrary. You see, in that sense, Feuerbach is a good example. In other words, when Feuerbach says that I'm projecting my wishes as a religious person onto a non-existent subject that I call God, and I make God the Candyman, the being who solves all the problems, who is the antithesis to the limitations of my existence. So what does God mean to me, says Feuerbach, if I'm a Christian, or in religion in general, but he zeroes in on Christianity, because he's again enough to take that as kind of the epitome of religion. Feuerbach. And Feuerbach says, well, God is important to me in religion because he's eternal. He guarantees that somehow or my experience of the limitations of nature are not final. Right? If there's a God, then I'll be resurrected, or I'll be immortal, or whatever, depending on how you want to slice your religion. You know what I'm saying? But he solves the problem of limitation. But Hegel, so the atheist here is a little taking the easy way out compared to Hegel, who's a theist par excellence, right? Not a good Christian from Kierkegaard's point of view, but you could see the rationalization of Christianity. And Hegel doesn't want to say that God is a solution to the limits of my experience. Quite the contrary. The limits of my experience represent the image forth to me that God himself is present in the negative. You see, he's not the answer to the negative. So now you go back to my allusion to Luther, right? The death of God in Luther is profound theology. Do you see that the crucifixion says what? That for Luther in an unqualified way, also for Thomas, but in a qualified way, right? In a qualified way, that is qua human, but qua person for Luther and for Thomas. They wouldn't disagree on this part. The person of God, the divine person, suffered death. Okay? Do you say? Well, then I ought not to be running to God to overcome death. See? Luther's extreme of that is, by the way, that there are three grades of people. There are those who really don't, they really don't want to go to hell. They really don't want to go to hell. And they don't think they're going to hell. But then there's a second grade, higher grade for Luther. Right? And those who consider that they might actually be worthy of damnation and just pray that they don't go to hell. And then the highest level of spirituality for Luther is those who, if it's God's will be pleased to go to hell. Right? So there is a kind of epitome of the notion I'm trying to get at here that's brought out scientifically, as it were, in Hegel. You see, that in other words, when I go to the notion of God, I don't go beyond the essence of this world. I don't go beyond the actuality of my concrete experience. He is not an alternative. He's not an unreal, ideal something or other. He's not a boogeyman, even a good boogeyman, right? You see what I'm saying? In other words, this is the divine experience, and Christianity epitomizes that in the crucifixion. That's where the Galga, Hegel's a great expression, which Tom Althuizer loves, okay? Which is the epitome of Althuizer's theology, although the originality of Althuizer goes beyond Hegel in this respect. The Galga of the spirit, that's the way Hegel concludes his analysis. I think it's in the phenomenology that he uses that expression, at the end of the phenomenology, right? So the death of God, although not in the Althuizerian sense exactly, right? But, the idealistic form of the death of God is the profound reality. You say that God is real. How do I prove that God is real? That God actually became a concrete individual man and died. Now, of course, in Hegel, the individuality or the particularity. Now, this is an ambiguity in our language, and I think it's also I don't know Danish, but I mean, I look up things, right? So I think in Danish you're going to have the same kind of ambiguity between the particular and the individual. You're a particular person, you're an individual, you know. And I can use those terms in everyday parlance interchangeably because we understand more or less what we're talking about, right? Technically speaking, there's a distinction, right? The particular is the second moment in the logical syllogism. The individual moment is the third moment. It's the overcoming of the individuation of the particular and the universal. The undividedness, that's what the individual is, right? So there's a certain ambiguity in the language. But you could say the individual man that God became in Christianity, he really became. That's critical to Hegel, right? Because in other words, if he really didn't undergo finiteness, which meant that he had to be a particular person, then it would have been a myth. Right? So if God actually became a concrete person and that person died, right, then what Hegel is saying is that the particularity of that person is as a natural, here's the key point, as a natural object is irrelevant. I mean, that person died and presumably rotted in the grave or whatever, right? Or depending on how you're going to read the resurrection, depending on who you are, right? Whether you're Altizer or Thomas Jefferson or whatever. But in any event, that historical person that I might have been in the same room with, that person that I could see, and here you see Kant, and you can also see Kierkegaard in his own way, that person, I can't have access to the spiritual reality of that person by apprehending that person as a temporal spatial reality. The paradox, the Hegelian paradox being that God had to become that temporal spatial reality in order to really manifest his creative power. You see, what in Thomas might be something like his omnipotence, right? But the paradox in Hegel is that having been said, it would be a profound mistake for Hegel to focus on that temporal spatial individual. All that need to have happened is that person was the creator of the world. But the flesh, right? And Paul says, and I think I quote Paul in some context, probably in the context of Kierkegaard. Paul says, if you read Paul very carefully, Paul never knew Jesus in the flesh, and he makes the point that the only Jesus he knows, Paul, is the crucified Jesus, right? The one who's dead, in other words, you see, and resurrected, you see, but not the Jesus in the normal temporal spatial sense, right? So that spiritual person who nevertheless, in order to be the person that he is, has to have actually been flesh and blood and suffered the ultimate testimony of finiteness, death, right? That hanging on to the flesh is not the point for Hegel. Okay. Now, of course, that's one of the things in the Catholic tradition is that the crucifix always has the body of Christ on the cross, right? It's characteristic. It's not true in all Protestant denominations, I think, but probably most all, except for maybe the Anglicans. I don't know. Are there any Anglicans in the room? Have the body on the cross? Yeah. But then the Anglicans don't think themselves as Protestants. So,
right.
See? So in the Protestant tradition, right, the Anglican Church roots itself in the patristic age. It goes back really to before the Middle Ages, right? And so, but the Protestant mentality is to decorporealize, right? To reduce somehow the ultimate significance of the flesh, even though in Hegelian terms, you see, it was a necessary moment in the salvation of the world. It's the momentary, right? So come back to Kierkegaard. So what is that?
Wait a second.
Yeah.
The current Catholic iconography is not the body destroyed on the cross; is the resurrected Christ on the cross.
Okay.
Right. And in fact, in the readings for this last Sunday, the Christ appears to his disciples after the original appearances and so on, and says, "You got anything to eat here?"
Yeah.
Right. And so he takes and eats a piece of baked fish, right? So that the, at least insofar as you're talking about the current the current Catholic view
Right.
of the death of God, right? It's not the rotting of the body in the grave.
Right.
It is the focus is on the resurrected
Okay.
corporeality,
Right.
if you will, right? And that resurrected corporeality gets hungry.
Right. Okay. Well, right. But you're just giving me another example of the main point I was trying to stress most recently, and that is that in Catholicism, the body, on the cross or resurrected afterwards, eating fish, the body still remains something to be experienced. Right. It doesn't get sublated. Aufhebung. It doesn't get annulled. It doesn't succumb to that, to being just a moment in the manifestation, the revelation of the divine, as it tends to do in Protestantism in general and in Hegel in particular. Okay. And also I think in Kierkegaard, right? In other words, I think in Kierkegaard, obviously Kierkegaard wouldn't have. I think the problem that Kierkegaard has by the absurd position that he is in of taking the position of the particular individual is that he has no natural warrant for doing so. In other words, Kierkegaard has bought into lock, stock, and barrel. The Hegelian version of the Lutheran either or, the Hegelian version is nature or spirit, right? And nature is there only to be overcome, to be annulled, to be sublated, so that the spirit can manifest itself, right? So Kierkegaard accepts that, and having accepted that, but that fundamental thing, but otherwise not being happy with the rationalization, the Hegelian rationalization, he has no nature to justify. In other words, he agrees with Hegel that as a natural man, he has no basis for this insistence on a kind of perfect particularity, on a kind of right. In other words, that he should be somehow the spiritually exceptional as a single individual, as it's sometimes translated. Okay, let's try and get to him. Let me just stop off on the way 229, 232. There's a kind of reprise of the faith and knowledge issue in Augustine and Thomas. On page 229 at the very bottom, by way of introduction to Kierkegaard, let us first compare Augustine to Thomas Aquinas on the question of faith's relationship to knowledge. And then quoting Augustine over on page 230 in the third line, our Lord himself, by his words and deeds, first urged those whom he called to salvation to believe. Afterwards, when he spoke about the gift he was to give to those who believed, he did not say, this is eternal life so that they may believe. Instead, he said, this is life eternal, that they may know thee, the one true God, and him whom thou didst send, Jesus Christ. So Augustine goes on, and a couple of lines down. For what is believed without being known cannot be said to have been found, and no one can become fit for finding God unless he believes first what he shall know afterwards. So when it comes to the relationship between faith and knowledge in Augustine, faith precedes knowledge, but faith alone is not sufficient for Augustine, right? And not only is it not sufficient, but it explicitly is the prelude or the condition for knowing God. And as he says elsewhere, dropping down another 5 lines or so, we must believe that these things are seen and grasped more clearly and fully by better men, and then, in case you don't get the message, even while they dwell in this world, right? So even in this life, right, if I have faith, and I'm Augustine, I understand that I can and ought to come to know what has been revealed to me, right? Now, I'm going to know it within certain limitations, but in this life, this is going to be possible. So we must hope, and disdaining worldly and human things, must love and desire divine things. Now, amplifying that, so Thomas says, by way of contrast, let's see. All right, let's start with the beginning of Thomas there in the bottom half of page 230. Out of a superabundant goodness, so that men might have a firmer knowledge of him, God reveals certain things about himself that transcend the human intellect. In this revelation, in harmony with man, a certain order is preserved, so that little by little he comes from the imperfect to the perfect, just as happens in the rest of changeable things. First, therefore, these things are so revealed to man as for all that not to be understood, but only to be believed as heard. For the human intellect in this state in which it is connected with things sensible cannot be elevated entirely to gaze upon things which exceed every and I emphasize this in a different context. Thomas emphasizes the complete disproportionality in the relationship between the creature and the creator. Right? So here's a specific example of that, but he does it more cosmically elsewhere. All right? The human intellect in the state in which it is connected with things sensible cannot be elevated entirely to gaze upon things which exceed every proportion of sense. But when it shall have been freed from the connection with sensibles, then it will be elevated to gaze upon the things which are revealed. There is then in man a threefold knowledge of things divine. The first is which man, by the natural light of reason, ascends to a knowledge of God through creatures, right? So by which he can, based in an anti-Hegelian way, by looking at his experience of the natural world, he can come to know that there is a God. I mean, you see, that's what Thomas is saying in effect there. Second is that by which the divine truth, exceeding the human intellect, descends on us in the manner of revelation. So we can have a revelation, something made clear to be seen, but as not as something made clear to be seen, perceived intellectually, understood in the classical sense of the word, but as something spoken in words to be believed. So I hear it, I don't see it, I take your word for it. You know, we have it in common language. You tell me something happened. You told me you had an accident on the way over here. I take your word for it. I didn't see it. And I don't see it. Just because you tell me it, and just because I believe it's true, doesn't mean I see it. Okay. So that's the way it is with divine revelation for Thomas, unlike Augustine. Right? And third is that by which the human mind will be elevated to gaze perfectly upon the things revealed. Right? Understand in the next life. Right? In heaven. So both of them agree that the sensible basis or the sensible aspect of our intelligent experience is an impediment. They both understand that. But Augustine has the notion that he can withdraw, the soul can withdraw itself, and this sets up on another cosmic level, it sets up the Cartesian meditation possibility, you see. Descartes abstracts himself from the universe. Augustine, 800 years previously, fundamental notion for Augustine is that the soul can return within itself, meaning it can recognize, it can distinguish itself, if it puts its mind to it, so to speak, puts itself to the task, it can distinguish itself from its lostness in sensible things. So for Augustine, the soul, by habit, really by a kind of, who does this remind me of? Oh, it's one of the phenomenologists. It's got to be probably all of them. I don't know if it's Husserl or Merleau-Ponty, but it's an Augustinian idea in root, right? That, and maybe it reminds me of Descartes too. Right? That the soul is lost; it confuses itself with it. No, but it's the maturation idea. It's got to be Husserl. In other words, we come into the world for the last 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Have I got everybody covered?
Well, you haven't covered Buddha, but go ahead.
And we have this experience of things, you know, and so naturally it requires a critical move. Maybe in this sense Husserl is an Augustinian. You see, it requires a critical move to distinguish our consciousness from its content. As you say, or to distinguish the content. Now, maybe in Husserl it would be more to distinguish the content of consciousness from, and a kind of Kantian prelude here, from the ultimate reality, the ultimate substance, right? But however you slice it, it goes back to Augustine, right? So the soul can withdraw into itself, recognizing and distinguishing itself from those things, material things, with which it has habitually confused itself, thoughtlessly or uncritically confused itself. And at that point, it can see, to some extent, it can understand directly, even in this life, as he says, better men can know God in this life. Right? Whereas Thomas, the epistemological fact in Thomas, which we dwelt upon when we were comparing him to Aquinas' epistemology, is that, and so in that sense, you see, the so-called Neoplatonic Augustine is really, because the Neoplatonics were Aristotelians and they were Platonists, he's in continuity there, because in Aristotle, all human knowledge begins with sensible experience, but we said, as contrasted with Thomas, it doesn't end with sensible experience. Even though it ends in a way that transcends my reason, it ends beyond both reason and its sensible basis in an act of genuine knowledge for Aristotle. So Aristotle could say, in a way a little less direct than Augustine, that in this life, if he thought this way, I can know things in this life because, okay. So in Augustine, there's something of that continuity or that contact is still available to the human knower and the divine reality, even though the divine reality has changed its nature radically from Aristotle to Christianity. In Thomas, ironically, going back to Aristotle, he goes one step further than Aristotle and sets up the Kantian possibility. In other words, not only, as in Aristotle, is it true in Thomas that all human knowledge begins with experience, meaning experience of things in time and space, the sensible world, but in Thomas, that is so radically the case that whatever I know can never get beyond that sensible origination. So he substitutes for knowing the substance of things in the act of knowledge, which we said some meetings back, he substitutes the likeness of things. I know the thing through the likeness in the soul of the knower. The knower knows the thing right, through the likeness. He does not know it by an identity beyond reason in essence. You see, he knows it within the transcendental framework of reason. He knows it as another. In the act of knowing, he knows it as another because at the same time knows the intelligible species to be but the likeness of that thing known. Right? Okay. Now we want to move on from there. Let's start with Kierkegaard here. On page 233, just recapitulating that as a prelude to Kierkegaard, on the bottom half of 233, Augustine, in intellectual sight, understood what first he believed. Thomas, on the authority of God's word, believed to be true what he heard, though the truth of what was revealed was not apparent. Kierkegaard, by virtue of the absurd, is committed in passionate inwardness to what at the same time repulses as absolute paradox. So we've made quite a series of steps, right? To first having to believe. So, in other words, for all of them, right? There's no disagreement here. For all of them, without faith, you're lost. But, I mean, you're lost both spiritually, intellectually, no matter how you slice it. You're not going to know, without faith, for Augustine, the truth of your own being, let alone God's being, unless you first believe. That's clear in Augustine, right? So that's not the issue. The issue is, how far does faith take me? Right? Right? And so for Augustine, faith is the prelude to knowing. For Thomas, faith, maybe more knowing in this life. For Thomas, faith is a prelude for knowing, but not in this life. And for Kierkegaard, faith is not a prelude to knowing; it's the antithesis of knowing, right? And in that sense, he concedes. What I like to say, he concedes, as it were, too much to Hegel, right? But he concedes everything to Hegel. And in that sense, what I was talking about before, that the transcendent deity has disappeared by the time we get to it, right? And for a reason, it's a slow process, do you say, beginning with the radical subjective move of Descartes, who in effect, he says it very gently, he left his faith, his morality, my language, on the doorstep. That is, he does not subject his faith nor his morality to his methodical scientific doubt, which is another way of saying he leaves faith and morality outside the realm of knowledge. Well, what do you expect Kant to do? Kant picked up on that. So morality is very important, and moral faith is very important to Kant. But it's alongside of, and not to be confused with, not to be mixed in with scientific knowledge for Kant. But Descartes had already done that effectively without making a big deal out of it. Because he just focused on science, you see? Okay, so Kierkegaard he's profoundly, he's not only Hegelian, but Hegel is. And so that transcendent deity, that deity who is known by, okay. So what is this what's the practical meaning of revelation then? It means that there's an intervention. Now, Kierkegaard turns this into an absolute impossible tale, you see, just to demonstrate how absurd things are, right? But the point is, forget the absurd part. The original idea was that God actually enters into the world, as it were, ontologically, metaphysically, however you want to put it, from outside the world. He's not a part of the world to begin with. He's not tied into the world eternally, as Aristotle's God is, you see. He existed in such a way that there was no world, as it were, at one time, as difficult as it is to get our mind around that, okay? And then, despite all of that, he enters in, tells us what we need to know, okay. So if Kierkegaard finds that in the middle of the 19th century, a completely different idea that, if I were to take it seriously, pulls me out of my own, not only out of the world, pulls me out of my own natural understanding of myself, you see. A lot will have transpired in order to bring Kierkegaard to reading it that way, a way that neither Thomas nor Augustine felt intellectually compelled to read it that way, even though they agreed in principle that revelation meant an intervention from some being who was, in Barthian terms, in some way, wholly other than the world that this being had created, right? So when I say that God has disappeared, that is the God of Revelation, I want to put it another way, because this is the way I do it in the appendix to the new book, Faith and Philosophy, the lecture on thinking in the third millennium, right? Another way of putting this, and it's interesting that Kant, this all ties in with time. We didn't do it, but you read it. I'm sure you read it and studied it carefully, and you understood it immediately. When Kant is talking about the angel of the apocalypse, did you remember that passage? And he says, the angel of the apocalypse says that, it blows the trumpet, and time will come to an end. And Kant says, time will come to an end? If we are to assume, and of course we're good German Lutheran Protestants and there's still a censor, and if we assume that the angel didn't mean to be talking nonsense, he must have meant change will come to an end. That's what Kant says. Right? And you say, well, what's he talking about? Well, first of all, what made me think of that is the apocalypse. Right, so let me come back. Make sure I remember to come back to the apocalypse. But notice there, what Kant is saying is, the angel, we cannot understand the angel to be serious if he didn't. He said time. I grant you, says Kant. He said time will come to an end. But saying time will come to an end is as absurd as Thomas would understand. So not unintelligible as saying time had a beginning. So this moment, this Kantian moment at the root of our consciousness, this time itself that does not change, cannot have a beginning or an end. Do you say, can change come to an end? Well, yeah, that's conceivable at least. It's not a contradiction in terms for something to stop changing, because I do have a concept of space. And I can do a Leahy. I can vacuum out the time, and I can conceive of change coming to an end. That I can conceive of, says Kant. I cannot conceive of time coming to an end. You see that? Now the point is, this passage that Kant quotes in order to make this point about the difference between time itself, in terms of the earlier part of this conversation, time itself and the change that takes place in time, what's the text? The apocalypse. And what is apocalypse? Just a fancy Greek word for revelation. You see? So in other words, another way of putting what happens in the course of history, right, beginning with, right, is the apocalypse goes away. The apocalyptic element. This is what, and so Tom Altice is trying to resurrect the apocalypse. Right? I think he suffers under certain limitations of modernity, but as an American, he has a shot at it. Okay, and anyway, but this is the issue. Okay, in other words, when I say that the transcendent deity of Augustine and Thomas has disappeared from the landscape, it's not an available option to Kierkegaard. Do you see? It's another. You could say it's the God of the apocalypse. It's the God who really reveals himself. You see, and now it's not that Kierkegaard is totally oblivious to this, right? But what I'm saying is that the apocalypse is now turned into absurdity. Okay, in other words, he's reaching in the middle of nowhere for this transcendent deity who created the world ex nihilo, who in the meantime has been erased, you see, from human consciousness as something to be taken seriously, intellectually, has been assimilated, or Kierkegaard talks in pedestrian terms about, in Denmark, Christianity, you're born a Christian, in effect, right? Now, you can be born a Jew, but you can't be born a Christian. You can't. technically, officially. Okay, dogmatically you can't be, right? But practically you can be. In other words, culturally, if you identify Christianity with something cultural, then of course you can be born a Christian. Right? So what I'm saying is that the apocalyptic God is another way of understanding what has vanished here. And so Kierkegaard and apocalypse, and so it's all very ironic, because apocalypse you think of Revelation, the kind of the light shining, right? But the apocalypse, the revelation has now become a darkness. Just as I'm saying, it's now become the new creation has now become the end of everything. I mean, it's taken on the apocalypse in that kind of negative sense that we associate with it, right? But the essence of the apocalypse is the positive intervention of revelation. It's the moment between the old world and the new heaven and the new earth, right? That's almost reminds of the interstice in Hegel, right? But Hegel has rationalized the apocalypse, might be another way of putting it. So that's the issue anyway. Okay. So it was Hegel who, by his synthesis of Leibniz's undifferentiated unity of substance and function with Kant's original synthetic function of reason, discovered the differentiated unity of substance and function in things themselves, and thereby rendered absolute that pathos of modern thought in which each moment of the thought of existence is itself reduced to non-existence. That is, individual, species, universe, each nothing itself, each a self-contradictory ground of absolute reason by virtue of its finitude. If in so doing Hegel defined the conditions of a life totally within the horizon of the truth of appearances, now you have to be clear here, right? The truth of appearances has, in Hegel's hands, has an affirmative meaning or a thoroughgoingly substantial meaning that it doesn't quite have in Kant, right? For Kant, the realm of appearances is the realm of scientific knowledge, but it is explicitly distinguished from the substantial noumenal realm, right? But the truth of appearances in Hegel is the truth of appearances that is, how can I put it? It's the truth manifesting itself in time and space. That's the truth of appearance. Appearances have truth in Hegel. The truth of the divine being, the divine creative self-knowledge, they don't have truth in and of themselves, but they have the truth as the appearances of that eternal truth, right? In that sense. So, and nevertheless, there is this identification. So, within the horizon, and this universe is immediately the divine idea manifesting itself in world process. Then it is Kierkegaard who, on behalf of the individual, and here's where the language ambiguity, both in Danish and in English, it's probably in every language, comes in, right? The individual, or the particular person, or sometimes the single individual, depending on the right. So meaning the individual here, not the abstract individual, but this particular individual, as it might be put, or this single individual, delineates what it means for that individual to exist, not in contradiction to itself, as in Hegel, but rather to exist in contradiction to its thought of itself, which is that universal function in terms of which it originally possesses its existence, as in itself finite, or ultimately nothing at all outside of the universal. This is Kierkegaard's what I call his transcendent passion to exist. Indeed, we may understand that unlike Augustine, for whom the prehension of God is the apprehension of truth, and unlike Thomas Aquinas, for whom the habit of faith is the beginning of eternal life, Kierkegaard's passion of faith begins in a perception of the nothingness of the individual coincidentally before God and before absolute reason. The issue of faith is immediate existence. Now, I want to back off a little bit from the immediacy of the text to go back to something I was saying when I was having to think through the text again. If you go back to that Kantian notion, which I'm trying to point at in our conversation, of this unchanging moment of time, the one that derives etymologically from to move, meaning metaphysically to cause, that temporality, which is the primordial causality of our experience, right? That primary moment, okay? Then to read Kierkegaard's using the moment centrally in his analysis of the eternal entering of the time, creating the moment, do you say? Creating a moment in a number of senses. The moment of God becoming man, the eternal entering into time, or as he sometimes says, and I point out the confusion in Kierkegaard between time and history, meaning by confusion that he doesn't sharply distinguish the two, that when the eternal enters into time or becomes historical, somewhat ambiguous usages, that's the moment for Kierkegaard. Also in Kierkegaard, another use of the moment is the moment in which I, as the single existing individual, relate myself in the way of a passionate decision to the truth or falsity or the factuality of that historical, or of that moment in history when the eternal entered into time. How I relate to that is the decisive factor in whether or not I begin to have an eternity. Now here's what I want to lay this over back on what I was saying about Kant's moment earlier, right? And again, this is reading through the texts, plural texts, reading through them, see, trying to understand more deeply what is going on in Kierkegaard, because there's a certain level at which it looks too easy. He sets up a real paradox, there's no question about it, but it is kind of abstract. You know what I mean? The eternal entity. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. I agree. So that's too easy. So why is it not too easy? What's really going on here? See? Well, that Kantian moment, as I'm calling it, which is a kind of unchanging temporality, okay? One way of understanding what we say that one way, I think Kierkegaard explicitly understands himself vis-a-vis Hegel, as he is the existentialist, Hegel is the absent-minded professor who has got this great idea, living idea if you want. He's got the greatest living idea called the system, see, about what Christianity is all about and ultimate reality and so on. And he's got that, except he just forgets to live it. I mean, in other words, he's got the idea as if this was the imperative. The imperative, however, is as an individual, concrete, single existing person. Where was Hegel on that score? And Hegel doesn't address it, right? So he assumes that Hegel was too busy with his world historical project. Okay. Which by the way, to be a good Kierkegaardian, may not be true of Hegel. We have no way of knowing this. But from the system is not the answer. That's Kierkegaard's point. Okay? So, all right, so that much is clear. That we don't have to read through the text to get to that. You can find that in Kierkegaard's text, in effect. But what I'm suggesting is that reading through the text, he must, if you think about it, a fortiori, I guess is the expression. If that's true in his relationship to Hegel, it's at least, if not more, true in his relationship to Kant. And what would the Kantian version of what Kierkegaard is requiring be? It's pretty clear what the Hegelian version is, right? To exist this contradiction, right? I want to say to embody the contradiction, to actually really existentially embody the contradiction, and you can only do that in the form of a decision, because what is a decision? You see, a decision is when the yes and the no come together in reality. That's where Kierkegaard is at, right? In other words, this dialectic of the good and the bad, or yes and no, however that you want to frame the dialectic, well, as long as I keep going back in thought, in a certain sense, you see, that is a kind of unending thing, as if, this is the Kierkegaard point, as if I had all of eternity. As if I was the embodiment of this divine, you understand? You see, there's no end to it, of course not. Right? If I were God, there'd be no problem. Okay? But if I'm this guy in Denmark, okay, what's the actual concrete version of this unending dialectic? Is I have to make a decision. That's how Hegel resolves the contradiction by an unending series of contradictions. Right? So no contradiction is final in Hegel. That's how Hegel gets beyond contradiction. You see, he doesn't have to out and out deny Aristotle's. That's a very good principle of non-contradiction. Right? So he can't simply mindlessly deny it. So he gets to deny it because no contradiction is the final contradiction. Right? But if I'm infinite, if I have eternity, if I have all the time in the world, if I were coincident with time itself, I want to do it this way, because this is where I'm leading up to. If I were simply time itself, no problem. Because change can take place in time itself, change in time takes place within the framework of the primordial moment that has been divinized in modern thought. And if I am that primordial moment, plain and simple, then I don't have to make a decision. Or I just keep making, I can be reincarnated. I can be reborn. I can just do this over and over again, and I can even make progress. But now, what if I'm not that? Okay. So what is Kierkegaard doing in Kantian terms? What I'm suggesting to you is this is what I was thinking about. He's existing the moment. See, in other words, again, just as he cannot be simply defined as a simple anti-Hegelian, like he was coming from the moon. So he's a Hegelian. Well, then he's also a Kantian, because Hegel was a Kantian, like Aristotle was a Platonist. Okay, so what I'm trying to point to, this time itself in Kant, time itself, that thing which does not change, even though appearances in time change, time itself has got that quality of the Thomistic divine now, the eternal now. Right? Is Kierkegaard going to start from scratch in a sense more profound than Descartes? No. So within the confines of subjectivity, what can he do vis-a-vis Kant? You see, what he can do is he can take that now divinized, I want to say, creative, not necessarily in the same exact sense as Thomas Aquinas, but that divine, creative, primordial moment at the root of the whole world of our experience, which itself does not change, and he can exist it. He can introduce it into time and space. He can temporalize and spatialize. How can he do that without becoming a professor? How can you temporalize and spatialize the primordial Kantian moment without writing a book? Well, you can live it. In other words, you are the temporal spatial here and now, do you see, changing in flux, do you see? And if you can embody that moment, you see? Now, of course, to embody that moment is impossible. I mean, in the same sense that it's absurd from a Hegelian point of view. In other words, that moment has to, how can I put it? It's the analog of the notion that the classical dogmatic notion that the creator becomes the creature, as the fabricator becomes the fabricated, as Dante puts it in the Divine Comedy. So the Kantian Kierkegaardian extreme version of this is that the primordial moment of temporality at the root of the whole world of our experience, which by definition itself cannot change, enters into time. So when he talks about the eternal becoming historical, do you see what I'm saying? It's not simply some abstract eternal that could be Plato's eternal or Aristotle's eternal. Do you understand what I'm saying? What Plato and Aristotle did for the eternal get carried forward and applied in history, right? And it's applied to the now, the eternal now of the divine reason in Thomas Aquinas. But it's reapplied after the radical subjectivity of Descartes. It's applied to this root temporality, which itself does not change, but which is the context for all changing appearances in time and space. If you can imagine that now divinized root temporality entering into time, that's the same contradiction, except that there's absolutely no basis to be able to explain it. I mean, yeah.
So does this have the effect, if I'm going to take up the narrative, let's say that the divine is present in Kant's eternal time, that is at the basis of all of our all conscious experience.
The unchanging time.
Right. The unchanging
time qua unchanging,
right.
Unchangeable. I'm saying is effectively, I have to be careful here,
right.
It's effectively the naturalized divine or the divinized nature. Right. Now, of course, it's hedged around for many different reasons and in many different directions.
So if I'm going to follow that, then is the move you're making now with Kierkegaard to suggest that eternality of time becoming naturalized in Kierkegaard, or becoming finite, that infinite becoming finite in Kierkegaard, is that the final kind of sucking out of divinity of time, despite what Kierkegaard is personally trying to do with his project? Is it the ultimate? Is it the?
I'm trying to say something analogous to what I would say about the somewhat ambiguous attitude of Descartes. I think it's somewhat ambiguous. The answer to your question in Kierkegaard, I think it's ambiguous. But if I had to make a forced choice, which I'd just soon not make, well, why make? It's something Ockham must have said something like this: "Don't make a choice if you don't have to." So if I don't have to make a choice, I don't want to choose between those. But if I had to choose, I would say it's further along. Yeah, I think it's it's very interesting. It's a kind of a desperate faith.
Right. So further along in terms of modernity.
Yeah,
I still don't know what your bias is. I don't know
well,
what further along means to you. So.
Well, I think it's. I like to say that in one sense, Althuiser's Death of God theology is like sort of this possible extension of modern consciousness. And I would say of Levinas, and I do say somewhere, not necessarily in this new book, but somewhere in something I wrote, that in Levinas we have the furthest possible intention of modern consciousness, turning inward. And so if I position Kierkegaard here, I would say the furthest inwardization of consciousness, the word that would distinguish him from Levinas is that Levinas is too much of a thinker. That is, in Levinas's case, I would say it's the furthest possible intention of consciousness. In Kierkegaard, it's the furthest the furthest actual intention of consciousness. That's this whole point. This is not a possibility. This is not an idea. This is not a schema for relating to other people. It's the actual you understand how I'm using this word in an unusual way. Yeah. It's the actual intensification.
Act being the key.
Yeah, the actual, right? And how can it be actual? How can this primordial temporality enter into time and space actually? Well, now think about it. The incarnation comes to mind. Do you see? But not the incarnation as an idea or something simply in the past. So in the latter half of the philosophical fragments, the whole thing is contemporaneity, right? In other words, the individual in the 19th century, the 20th century, the 21st century, right, is all of those individuals are equally close to the incarnation. They are equally close to the actual. Do you see what I'm saying? Every individual, as this particular single individual, has in common, if that individual has faith, is at least formally in exactly the same position as the incarnate Word was. Do you see that?
There's an overcoming of time.
I like that. I mean,
I didn't mean that you would.
Well, no, but I mean,
Sorry.
yes. In other words, an overcoming. I want to say more profoundly, and I allude to it here. I like it this way. I like it where you have to keep rereading it, because every time you do, you learn something. I mean for myself. I don't mean for you. It's not just an overcoming of time, but what I'm saying is, but for Kierkegaard, it would come to the same thing. But I'm saying what it really is, what Kierkegaard couldn't fully appreciate because he couldn't distinguish clearly between time and history. What it's really an overcoming of is history. Or another way of putting it is that it doesn't ever get to be quite history.
Well, not the final history.
Well, yeah, the end of history. Something like that. Or the actualization of history or something like that. Whereas I think the thinking now occurring would distinguish itself from Kierkegaard in this respect, that we now have a clear consciousness of history. I know it's not clear to us, but in principle, that is there available, a clear consciousness of history as such, that Kierkegaard couldn't quite get at. So,
But only perceptively.
as opposed to?
I don't know. You tell me.
Well,
it's
I mean,
your
so-
word. It's
Yeah.
a perception of the
Yeah,
history.
the perception I like. Just get rid of the word. Where did the only come from? What are you comparing it to? See, that's the point. In other
Well,
words,
why do you use the word? Perception.
I have to use the word. I could. Well, there is a reason for using the word. Because the thinking now occurring comes historically, as it were, in the wake of a world in which the divine has, in one way or another, come to be understood in the category of perception. Right? And even Kierkegaard, who is, in his own way, intensifying the disappearance of the apocalypse in the classic sense of the word, has to run through his critique the notion of perception is all over the place. In other words, it's the Kantian limitations of perception that reinforce for Kierkegaard the fact that his absurd faith has no longer any basis whatsoever in nature. So in other words, when he instantiates temporally spatially, that is when he literally embodies. We're talking about remember Aristotle, there's no body if it isn't alive. We're not talking about corpses now, right? So to embody is in his living temporal spatial being that he embodies this moment. So he exists this moment. Okay? Then the paradox, one level of the absolute paradox is that he embodies it in a way or in a place where he embodies it, but it's impossible to embody it. In other words, he does what is impossible for him to do, and as it were, he actually does it, and that is what he would understand as spiritual triumph, spiritual suffering.
So with Kierkegaard, that not only has the divine been erased from the history of being, but now reason is also being erased.
Yes, because in the course of time, they've come to be identified.
Right.
And the only qualification I would put on that is that they become to be identified where reason is one or another form of self-consciousness, in Hegel, absolute. Right? So I think in the text here that I just read, so he's in a position contradicting himself in terms of the thought of existence as opposed to the actual existence in its simple particularity, you see, which is, a particular outside of the syllogism is outside of thought. You see, and it's one of the meanings of the Danish word is simplicity. It's a certain simplicity, but it's a simplicity beyond the framework of the syllogism. It's a simplicity which is unavailable or outside of thought, but thought has claimed in the meantime to be, in effect, everything. Maybe not in Kant, everything. Kant was a little more modest, but in Hegel it has now come to be everything. Something like that. Well, we pushed the clock. Meditate, use the forum, and we'll see each other next Monday.